In September of 2014, the Vancouver International Tap Dance Festival invited one of the most influential practitioners of tap dance of the 20th century. She's a pioneer of rhythm, responsible for being one of the first to present tap dance in a full-length concert format, a great feat which was previously unheard of. Through the creation of the American Tap Dance Orchestra, she introduced audiences to the dance in a way that was both visually compelling and sonically dynamic. Her career spans decades and has witnessed both the greatest of elations and deepest heartaches. The Interviews is a series about survival, how to survive in a life of tap. In pursuit of this question, it is with great pleasure that we sit down with the legendary Brenda Bufalino.
I started studying tap along with many other forms when I was 5. I had a conservatory type training. When I realized that certain things I wanted to master, I couldn't keep dancing all styles. Certain things I wanted to master with the taps that I had not heretofore been able to achieve. Required so much practice and consideration that I stopped doing all other forms when I was about 38. When I was a young dancer, I was in my early teens, I would pass because I looked older then than I do now. And you go out on a gig and you'd be as either I'd be an exotic or I'd be a tap dancer, there'd be a comic, there'd be a dance team, there'd be a stripper, there would be 2 singers, so you might have 8 acts that would meet on the corner of Boylston Street in Boston, and every weekend you had work. Well, those clubs died. The venues stopped producing, and the people stopped going to nightclubs. When television came in, people stopped going out. Tap did not die. The opportunity to tap dance died. But I always felt that in a way it was fortunate that all stopped and that the movies stopped and everything stopped. There was no more tap in movies, no more tap on Broadway, no more. So what happened, as far as I'm concerned, is the esoteric form of tap dance is what lived. The real deep rhythmic structure, rhythmic jazz structure is what lived. The surface stuff fell away. Right? Now, the audience had never seen most of these black artists because they were not starring in movies. So when the concert stage came, the form was still alive in this esoteric way of deep love and respect for musicality, of integrity. So what happened? Why it died? Everything else died around it. But underneath here was this thing that lasted. And that's what we brought forward. So when we started opening up the venues and conceived of the idea of the concert stage, wow, here it was. Here's this form that nobody had ever seen before. When tap died, I had a calypso act where I wrote calypso songs and I toured my calypso solo act a lot. I'm pretty successful in that. And then calypso died, and then I found myself in the avant-garde, working for the National Council of Churches, which was the home of the avant-garde, which is very funny. That the National Council of Churches was doing the most far-out art in the country, till they found us out. The first job I had with that group which was Ed Summerlin on saxophone, Don Heckman, who is now the critic for the Los Angeles Times, the jazz critic, Ron Carter on bass. Sheila Jordan often sang with us, sang one of the first songs that I wrote. I had to recite from Sex and the Single Girl through a bullhorn while the band was playing different commercials, while somebody else was doing something else and somebody else was doing, this was all going on simultaneously. And I thought it was the most horrible thing I'd ever heard. Because what? It was horrible. And then I sat down. I couldn't keep going. I sat down in a pew because here's all these poor parishioners, my Sunday morning service. And I listened and I said, oh, that's what's going on. Because what they were playing were the songs that were being played during the convention. And the piece was called Convention, during a presidential convention. So it had all the cacophony of what goes on in the convention and all the stupidity and the crassness and the, and the vaudeville of it, And I got it. And I got very energized by that. It's in my book. I have a little bit of chapter on the avant-garde because I realize people don't know what you're talking about when you say avant-garde. What was the avant-garde? So Eddie and I were on a boat, the Alexander Hamilton boat in the South Street Seaport, as part of Charlotte Moorman's Avant-Garde Festival in New York. And this was late 60s. And we were in the bottom of the boat. The whole boat was electronic. We were at in the bottom of the boat, and I was hanging from this wire, climbing on this wire, and dunking myself in a barrel. I liked barrels in those days for some reason. All my pieces had something to do with barrels. I'm not sure why, but anyway, while he was playing electronic music, synthesizer music, so I'm dunking myself and climbing and dunking and climbing. And Charlotte Moorman, at the end of the festivals every day, this was 12 days, she would submerge herself in a water tank and play her cello underwater. That was then broadcast over the whole ship. Well, one day, all the electronics went out because everybody was wired. The whole boat was wired. Everything stopped. So nobody could work. Well, Eddie had a saxophone, and I had my tap shoes. The whole boat was in our cage. And that, to me, in a way, that was like the beginning of the tap revival. I was in this cage at the bottom of the Alexander Hamilton boat. After my divorce, during that period of time, I did have to start teaching and support myself with, had to give up the farm. So I started teaching. I had a studio, a theater, and I also started putting together my one-person shows at that time, and including tap dance in them. And more, the audience wanted to see tap dance. I said, what's going on here? Why do they want to see that? Why not they like my serious work, right? So finally I said, well, if they like what I'm doing so much, they should see my teacher. So I had studied with Honey Coles when I was 17, and he in New York City, and he had, at that time he got quite sad, and he never thought tap would come back. So went and got him. I found him. The Copacetics were doing an unusual gig with Cab Calloway, kind of reconstruction thing. And I found him there and went up to him, and it was quite a regathering of the tribe. He was drinking heavy in those days because he watched tap dance die. He went to work at the Apollo. He watched jazz die at the Apollo. He watched his whole world collapse. I mean, he was a consummate professional. And he was quite bitter. So it took a little rallying to really get him. I mean, the sound of his taps were sublime. So if I were going to dance with him, my sound had to reach his. You cannot, I realized you can't have two people on stage with two different sounds. Your pitch had to be the same. Your approach to the floor had to be the same. So many details of working that one dance.
You were describing, I think it was like one of the first times you were on stage with Honey. I think you were doing Take Me a Chance.
Yes, yeah.
Like realizing this insanely charismatic figures beside you, and you had to keep.
Oh, that was amazing. The first time I performed with him was such a shock. Such a shock. It was like being electrified. Because he seemed so relaxed, but there was nothing relaxed about him on stage. And yet, all appearances were, no. So that was incredibly shocking. I don't think I really realized who he was as an artist till we were on stage together. So much of his artistry had to do with presentation. And that's why it was great that I went back with him, because that's what my mother had. He and my mother were very good friends. They came from the same era. They both loved their audience. So what happened when they got on stage, they grew, they expanded to incorporate their audience. I did not understand that, even though I'd been in show business almost 30 years when I performed with him. I never got that until I worked with him. Then I knew what work I needed to do on another level that I had never done. Up until that point, something in me always felt I had to prove something. Working with him and going back to how my mother was, it was no longer that. It became filled with communication and incorporating the audience into what you were doing. So that made you bigger. You weren't up there trying to be the fastest, you were really for me, what I was able to start doing was integrating into myself in a more deeper way to reach them to come to me, instead of pushing out and thinking I had to get them somehow. It totally changed. So working with him was absolutely magical, frightening, because at first I didn't understand it. Also, I had been his student when I was a kid. I better prove that I can do this. But fortunately for me, I kept my solo work and my avant-garde working at the same time, because in a sense, working with Honey was going backwards in time to an earlier time of show business that I had left in the 50s, right? But it was really great to do that, because what I have realized at the end of working in the avant-garde, what we were putting people through was just vaudeville anyway. There wasn't that much difference between what we were doing and what vaudeville was, Vaudeville had a strong impact. It wasn't subtle, It was powerful. Sometimes the jokes were crass. Sometimes that, you get pie in your face, right? Well, I'm tying people up in the pews. What's the difference between throwing a pie in someone's face and tying them up in a pew? You could say my work from then on was a combination of the avant-garde and old show business.
Historical, poetical, gathering intellectual rhythms up inside his giant female form of a contrabass. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Come on, play some. We can do it together. Woo, 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 woo.
Okay.
Exploding! Exploding. 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 Thank you. With creative expositions.
And but having been in the avant-garde, it brought me away from the idea of always being symmetrical, of always being understandable. I had a taste for not being understood. Please don't understand me. I mean, if we didn't lose half of our audience in the avant-garde, we failed. They needed to walk out for us to be successful.
All the men that make up this portrait are members of the Copacetic Club. In solo, duos, or trios, they have worked most of the concert halls, theaters, and major clubs in this country and abroad. The Roxy, the Palace, the Apollo, the Cotton Club, the Palladium still ring with the sound of their taps and the joy of their artistry.
It's so fascinating what American culture does. It's like, why did I get the funding, any funding for Great Feats of Feet? It was not for tap dance. I got a little small grant. When I first went with the proposal for tap dance, they laughed at me. I said, what are these old guys? What do we want to do? They're not even good looking. Who are they? I was working with the video gorillas. Electronics was the big deal. I had made a videotape with this avant-garde artist where I put my taps onto his waterfalls that he was creating as the score. That's what got the money for Great Feats of Feet. Not the Copacetic. So you gotta be cagey, man. You really, it's like, okay, I couldn't get it that way, maybe I can get it that way.
Oh, let me play that haunted melody. I like to dance swing, but baby,
I started filming them with the first Porta-Pack camera, handheld. And in the early 70s, when I had them come up for the first time to New Paltz. That was probably the most magical period of my life. I don't know why I did what I did then. It was a calling. It was a calling. And I was part of some video gorillas at that time, you know, with the rain dance people, Nam June Pike. I was very interested in the avant-garde of video. We were all creating this new form. We had great hopes for it. So that's why I had the camera. I didn't get the camera to film tap dance. I got the camera to make art movies. A whole show of tap dancers was unheard of, never done. The most a tap dancer could ever do on stage, Maybe if you were in Boston, you could have a 15-minute act. But most of the time, it was 7 to 12 minutes. That's it. You did the same act for 20 years. So here's a whole new form. That's what I tell people, that tap dance as a concert art form is still brand new. Right? It's still almost unknown because part of the problem is we have not had writers that can write about it well. And it's so complicated, and it looks so simple, the more complicated it is, that it has not been written about well enough, presented strongly enough. Concert Stages we were working with the American Tap Dance Orchestra for 10 years to 2,000 to 5,000 seat houses. Then it stopped abruptly. Another thing died. So, my company, the American Tap Dance Orchestra, had to close. No more funding. Jazz tap hardly worked. Jazz tap ensemble hardly worked anymore. You know, people who were aligned with universities, or like A.C. Gray, who had funding and local support, kept going. No local support for anything in New York. Savion show in the funk style of tap arrived at a time of a real break in NEA funding. Right? Everything just stopped. And it didn't just stop for us individual artists, it stopped for the theaters. They stopped getting money.
Was that was that federal funding or the local?
All funding. But NEA specifically, because NEA ended up going to the States. You know, if the States didn't get from the national, it just never filtered down. So the funding all changed. Everything changed. And everything changed at the time of Bringing the Noise. When that was, and there was a lot of propaganda that came out of that, a lot of articles that were very pejorative to many of us in the field. It caused a lot of rifts in our tap community that have pretty much healed. It's a pretty great community today. I'm thrilled. I'm really thrilled. I love where we are today. Yeah. So that happened, but also something else happened that was very powerful. And it began to happen with Gregory, is this idea to dance to pop music again. Gregory had that desire to bring tap dance into contemporary music, as tap dance was originally made through jazz. That was the contemporary music of the time. Well, what was the contemporary music? It was funk. Loud, insistent, abrasive, aggressive. That kind of knocked the rest of us out of the ballpark. And that became the only thing that existed, because America's got a one-track mind. And his style became the only one available. And it also was decided, partly by him and that show, that the rest of us couldn't do it, that the rest of us really weren't doing it. Whatever it was, we were not doing it. Now, when Gregory went his direction, he included all this. He said, hey, I'm doing this, but you're doing that, you're doing that. Come on, we're all doing this. Good, you're doing that. I just chose this. Well, when Savion came, that became the only thing. We have, in tap dance today, I'm looking for somebody who has a voice. It's not Savion. And the beautiful thing that happens, and I really attribute it to him, because of that energetic thing, we got 1,000 kids, which we never had. We got all these kids who can dance their cans off. Now, how do we turn them into artists?
What a stark contrast from avant-garde, solo artist, improvisationally based, to the American tap dance orchestra. That's sort of not how I get it together.
Yeah.
Talk to me about why that made sense.
Why does that make sense? Well, it makes musical sense. When I first came back fully to tap dance, there's a vision that I had of an orchestra. I had that vision. It was a vision. I saw it, I understood it completely then. But there were no tap dancers. And I remember saying to Bubba Gaines, one of the copacetics, my idea. He said, well, it's a great idea, but you'll never be able to do it because you'll never find dancers who can execute it or who will want to. I had always been so diffuse in my performances, and my biggest problem was I had too many ideas. So the orchestra, by the time I had the orchestra, what was great about the orchestra, it was so clear what it was. It wasn't, the content, the storyline and the subtext was there, but really its job was to be an orchestra. So the tales, the whole presentation was so clear in my mind as music. It just gave me the opportunity to be a composer. That was my joy, and to have trained these dancers to be so brilliant. It took many, many years for the orchestra to even happen. It didn't just one day let's have an orchestra. I had 3 different companies before I understood what was necessary to get what I wanted. And I always loved counterpoint. I never could understand, even as a kid, why is everybody dancing the same step? That's stupid. So always loved it. I mean, I love Bach. I love classical music where you heard that. What's interesting is you didn't hear that in swing, but you did hear it in Dixieland and New Orleans, which had a big influence on it. That was simultaneous improvisation and counterpoint. Swing had no more. Bebop brought that back. Not much, though, but every once in a while, people would play together. But Mingus was the one who did it the most. That's why I study Mingus. So counterpoint philosophically, in that, here we sit by this water, the young dancers are here, middle dancers there, the new dancers coming out, this old lady, this fan going, everything, here's counterpoint, here it is. So it has to do with peripheral vision, but then pulling it all in to one thing. Fascinates me. Absolutely. Because at that particular time, I was giving out too much energy. It was the clown. It was that, that dark kind of thing that I would be so exhausted after a performance and so depressed that I felt I had had a baby and everybody took it. They asked for everything. I just gave everything and they took it. And then I did all this work on myself. How do I have the baby, share the baby, and then take the baby home? And I figured that out. And that has been really the source of my longevity and my happiness.
So what did you figure out? How did you do it? How do you do it?
By, in performance, to really be in a place of deep sensation, of being totally involved in what I'm doing, but just as we started this interview, of bringing the audience with me rather than doing that. So what happens then, as I did more and more of my one-person shows, I started perceiving that this audience is my partner. They're my partner. They didn't come here to hate me. They didn't come here to have something proved to them. They came for us to experience magic together. Now, in order for me to make magic, I have to be in my body, really sensing myself and remain conscious of my tone, my texture, of what I'm doing, and also be able to do that. And there's something about the absolute pleasure of being in the present for each minute of it. You have your concept over here. And that's great that you do. But it's the step-by-step, serious and total engagement in that moment that keeps it from being a grind. Right? Yeah, this is over here. But if you stay over there, then everything's miserable because it's going to take so long to get there. But each time a group of dancers can get on a groove with a time step, you can get happy.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a grind. Yes, it's persistence. I have no patience, but I'm incredibly tenacious. I quit every day. I have quit show business every day of my life and come back the next day. But yes, every minute is a grind. But every minute, if you're there for every minute, and really getting into the small stuff, the pleasure. I mean, like when I found out that I didn't have a sound in my own taps, I was teaching from 9 o'clock till 7 o'clock at night. I had one child still living with me who was in deep trouble. I had 78 cents and nothing in the refrigerator, and my car was held together by a rope. And I'd come home from work at 7 and practice till 2 in the morning. Because I heard that sound and I couldn't get it. And that was for probably about 3-4 years. And I was already my late 30s. So it's like in different periods of your life, I've found you come up against a challenge. You don't just come up against it once. I mean, I used to study with Sevilla Fort and climb up the stairs when it was time to go. I'd take 4 classes every day and then work until 4 o'clock in the morning, 3 shows a night. Then worked at something else. But you come up against yourself 3 or 4 times. And what I find in teaching, why there are so few masters, is that when you come up against yourself, the more advanced you get in what you're doing, the harder it gets. And that's when people quit. You guys have had teachers. That's amazing. We didn't have teachers. I mean, Honey would show me something. Say, well, how do you do that? He said, I don't know, figure it out. They're not gonna, they wouldn't tell, they didn't even want to tell you. You know, they didn't want to tell you their secrets. So, so I managed, after getting gout and hurting myself and getting worse before I got better, to find a technique that still works for me today. And I've made 2 DVDs on it. It's called Where the Action Is and Double Time Series. So I developed a palette that really did not include too much of my physicality, right? Because, I mean, Sam's physicality is definitely part of his style. I don't want to be trapped in as a primitive dancer, say, because or an Afro-Cuban dancer, and that's what I bring to the tap, or a ballet dancer, which I want to still keep all those things going. But this tap thing, this technique is very specific for a sound that I want and a fluidity that I want that can go there and then can go there, you know, can move all over the place. I want to dance freely and easily. I want tone, I want precision, I want clarity, and I want a scale from at least 5 notes. Each of us, we come up against ourselves, our biggest features. And we either face it or we don't. And it's very simple. It's not complicated. You're gonna face it. And it hurts. You see it. It's painful. You probably cry a little. And then you slog. That's the slog right there. That's it. When you come up against yourself. Whether it's your temperament, like my temperament is irascible. You know, Bufalino, I'm Italian, I'm Yankee, and I'm Indian. That's not easy. You know, it's not easy to be me. It's not easy to love me either, you know. But I have to come up against myself. How do I work with my own elements? My own negativity, my own over-expressiveness, bring it back. You don't need all of that for that event. Bring that back. Bring this forward. So much intelligence is needed. Philosophical work, whether it's a practice of some kind. I mean, you can take drugs. That's one way to do it. I didn't choose that way. I've chosen philosophical or esoteric work to deal with myself. Because that's what you're dealing with. You know, you come up against that slog. You have all this stuff, oh, great, and then, boom. That's it. Can't get any farther. You see something. You see something in yourself. You say, oh, God, I didn't think that was true. What do you do then? What do you do at that moment? You either make it or you don't.
I had one partner who could not conceive of people not speaking the English language. He just could not believe that there was anybody in the world who didn't speak English. He'd never been out of the country before. So everywhere we go, he say, I want bacon and bacon. He just thought that he wasn't saying it properly.
One of the big things about tap dance that's so great and that's also so dangerous artistically is this nostalgia and sentimentality we have about the form. The storytelling is so great, But you can get lost in the family, absorbed in the family. Now, some people want that. For some people, that is great. For me, would have been very dangerous, as dangerous as being lost in my own personal family. For me, as an artist, you have to be outside and inside. You can get trapped so much. We have more sentimentality and stories in tap dance than the Bible. And you can get trapped in that. So it really is looking at yourself. What do you hear? What do you want to see? And what palette do you need to get there? What's your palette? Now, what I'm seeing today is that pretty much everybody's got the same palette. That was not the case with the older dancers. Everybody had their own palette, you know? So I think if I could say to any of the younger dancers, what's your palette? Not your trick. Not your trick. I'm not talking about your trick. But what's your palette? What are all your colors? Here's your, a palette. You've got to, like my palette, if I'm painting it, it all comes from this gray palette to make my purple, to make my red, to make, all the colors that go into that, into my palette. What's your palette? Is your palette sufficient to get what you want, what you're hearing? Some dancers are more physical. Some dancers like a hard marble kind of sound. But what is it? What is it for you? I know what mine is. So when I teach, I'm going to teach that. If people want that, then that's what they get from me. It's my palette. So a master, when I always get a big kick out of you see master classes. What the hell does that mean? Does that mean the person is a master? Does that person have their own palette that they're sharing, something unique? Or is it a class?
What is a master?
A master is someone who understands their palette. That's what I'm talking about. Understands themselves. Has worked to achieve a vision. And understands how they got there so they can transfer it to other people. Now, a teacher, say, well, I can teach you some of honey, I can teach you some of baba, I can teach you some of this, I can teach you some of that. That doesn't require me to have my own palette. I've accumulated a bunch of steps. I think because we have so many youngsters now who are interested in dancing, this is a great support system for the tap dancers, for young professionals to be able to teach, to develop their skills as teachers, to develop their palette, right? It's a great way. I mean, when we started teaching in those early festivals, we didn't know what the hell we were doing. It was thought that you could not teach this form, that you could either do it or not. You couldn't be taught it. So that if you were ever going to become really good, you needed to be a protege of someone, right? Now, we learn to teach groups of people. Amazing. It's fabulous. It's fabulous. So hopefully, the next group of dancers, hopefully you're producing and you're including in your production some wisdom and some depth, that it's not all flash. If we keep going all flash, believe me, it will die again. We've already lost a tremendous amount of audience. If you remember, I said we were dancing to 2,000 and 5,000 seat houses. 10 years of touring. Do we have that now? No. Why? Because the audience doesn't like what we're doing.
That's just a plain ordinary walk.
tap. Have another tap. Another tap.
We're dancing for each other. That's not going to build audience. So I think the festivals are fabulous. But I think we've got a lot of work to do and a lot of thinking to do. When we danced, we included our elders. Nobody ever asked me to come and dance with them. The great people who are performing now. Now, I don't particularly care. It's not like, oh, I'm looking for a gig. I'm not. I got plenty to do. But what it does, it deprives the audience of seeing some relationship, which we offered them. We offered them. Lynn did. I did. Heather did. The audience is not being offered that today. Perspective. So I'm hopeful that the dancers will increase their wisdom as they produce to think about the audience as well as each other. That's the answer. And I'm not talking about selling out either. That's not what I'm talking about. But if you have an entire evening of slamming and dancers dancing for each other, that's not art. That's a tap jam.